Hello and welcome to First Flight, a Star Trek Enterprise rewatch podcast where we are watching and discussing each episode of Enterprise in succession. First Flight is a proud member of the Tricorder Transmissions Network.
This is Commander Tucker of Enterprise. We've got some information you're going to want to hear.
Welcome, Enterprise fans. I am your co-host, Melanie.
And I'm your co-host, Abby.
And tonight we are discussing the 6th episode of Season 1, The Andorian Incident. This episode was written by Fred Decker, based on a story by Rick Berman, Brannon Braga, and Fred Decker. It was directed by Roxanne Dawson, and it aired on October 31st, 2001. But before we begin our discussion, we need to issue a read alert.
Tactical alert. All hands to stations.
There are potential spoilers ahead. We might end up talking about any part of the series at any time. And now for a summary of the episode, it's time for Abby's Captain's Log. Okay, Abby, let's go.
Captain Starlog Supplemental.
All right, this is one I know a lot of people have been waiting for. So my summary of the Andorian Incident is, Archer convinces T'Pol to take them to visit the Vulcan shrine of P'Jem, and they encounter much more than they expect in their first dealing with the Andorians and Commander Shran.
All right, it's time to deploy our subspace transmitters and get into this episode. Abby, what did you think of the Andorian Incident?
Well, I want to start with the cold open, because this is a cold open with no dialogue, but it is a good one. And Shran's entrance into the shrine is just a chef's kiss. I mean, he didn't even speak the first two scenes that we see him in, and you already have a feeling of who he is and why he's there and what's going on. And that's amazing. And I'm a fan of cold opens. I like shows that have them. I like shows that use them as a teaser more than a chapter. And this is one of those ones that's really perfect. I mean, you don't know anything about what's going on, but you know the tone of this episode within about 30 seconds.
Oh, most definitely. And I am a huge Shran fan. He's one of my favorite characters. It was great to see his entrance here. And this is definitely one of my favorite episodes. And
this is a fantastic cold open. It just kind of hits you. It has big impact.
Yeah, you know that there's a lot coming after this. And that's well done in this episode. This is a meaty one for sure. And one of the things that I noticed right away in this cold open is that we hear their footsteps as they walk in, and throughout the whole time that we're in the sanctuary, or even in the atrium or the courtyard to the sanctuary, you hear the footsteps. And I think I noticed that so much because it did make it feel more rustic and more kind of primitive than what's on the ship. And I also know that the people on Star Trek in general go out of their way to take out footsteps when they're on the ship, because somebody way back when, it might have even been Gene Roddenberry himself, said that you wouldn't hear footsteps in space because the carpet would be that good. So whenever I do hear footsteps in Star Trek, it always stands out because they're there very purposefully. And if you start looking and listening for them throughout this episode, you're going to really notice how they're placed carefully. So props to all the people doing the sound in this episode for that, because it's so little, but it makes a big impact.
We must think alike, because I had something in my notes about the sound also. I did notice in this episode, particularly when Trip and Archer and T'Pol are in the atrium at the beginning part of the episode, you can actually hear wind blowing or something like wind blowing, which also gave it that feel that you were talking about, that kind of rustic country feel. And I was noticing that and thinking that the sound is very interesting in this one. So I'm with you on that.
All the little details that really show the love that the creators have for this show, for sure.
And the other thing about the cold open that I really appreciated was when this was first aired back in the day, we hadn't seen Andorians on the screen for a very, very long time. So this was a really great wow moment. And for someone like me who loves both Vulcans and Andorians, I really appreciated that. When I first started watching Star Trek, when I was drawn to Spock and the Vulcan culture and the spirituality and all things Vulcan, I thought, well, this is an episode for me because we're going to get to see all that cool ancient Vulcan stuff. But then to have the Andorians also, it was like a double whammy of goodness.
Yeah, and I really liked the upgrade that the Andorians got in makeup and costuming and those antennas that move. And while I do know that there are a couple times you can see a few spots where like the makeup is rubbing off of somebody's neck on their costume, or, their eyes aren't quite all the way, those antennas make up for any little bit of smudging or anything else because they are just another part of their emotion and their feeling and their character. And, I kind of wonder if Andorians play poker, and if they do they cover their antennas because they're a tell. And I think that's a really interesting thing. I mean, Trip even makes a comment about, getting your antennas twisted. He knows within a few minutes of being around them that that's something he needs to look at. And I think they did them very well. And as we go through this series and we see the Andorians more and more, you can see them just making tiny little tweaks to this to make the makeup and the antennas and all of that just that little bit more perfect and a little bit easier for the people in them. But wow, the impact of this the first time you see them and the lighting and the sound, it's powerful.
Definitely. I love the upgrade that they did with the antennas and the animatronics and the emotions as you're describing. And Commander Shran has emotions throughout the series. I'll put it that way. And I love that. And he makes a great entrance here. And seeing his feelings through the antenna are very, very interesting. So I agree that was a great move. And might I add that I find it very endearing that the Andorian weapons fire is blue?
Yes. That is fun. Kind of perfect.
So then we have this great scene with T'Pol and Phlox having their conversation together in the mess hall. And I think I've mentioned this before, but I always really appreciate the Phlox T'Pol conversations where he helps her to see things in a non-aggressive way. He has this way of giving her some things to think about. And again, seeing Phlox's wonderful enthusiasm over eating and sensory things, I find extremely delightful.
Phlox just is delightful. That's the perfect word for him. And I also like them as the two non-humans on the ship having these interactions. And I do think it starts as him more mentoring her because he's been in the interspecies medical exchange. He's had more experiences. But by the end of the show, you see that comes back too, and that she is giving back to him as much as he is giving to her. And it's really neat to see those foundations being laid now, and how much we've talked about and we will talk about T'Pol and the trust between her and her crewmates. And it seems like there was already kind of an innate sense of trust between her and Phlox because they are the aliens on the ship and they have that commonality that nobody else shares, that their relationship seems a little bit deeper and more personal quicker than it does with the others. But before we leave this scene, I have to say, and I've been paying extra close attention to the food. I like food. I like eating. I like cooking. But man, let me tell you, T'Pol has a lousy lunch. Like, it is a couple pieces of celery, some kale, some radicchio. There's no protein, there's no carbs. I completely understand her being vegetarian. I was for decades. But you still need some more in there. Now, I don't know Vulcan physiology. Perhaps they don't need as much protein. They don't need as many carbs. But there's a lot more good vegetarian food out there than raw, plain vegetables. I mean, she doesn't even have a sauce. So I was just thinking, since the last couple times they've had these beautiful dinners and, all these dumplings and turkey tetrazzini and Asian foods and all this. And now she's having some carrot sticks. So it's a little disappointing, but the Phlox and the celery moment was perfect. Absolutely perfect.
I know. I love when he grabs the celery. That's so Phlox. It's funny. I had a note about this also. I agree. I know this was 20 years ago, and vegetarian, vegan food has come a long way in 20 years. However, I do have a little bit of a pet peeve about media portraying vegetarianism this way with lettuce and celery in the plate that was shown here.
Yes.
I agree with what you're saying. Let's have Chef whip up some awesome casserole or something.
Yeah.
There's plenty out there. So, yeah, I agree. And we can laugh about that. Before we leave this scene, though, I have another thing to add, which is when Phlox says, what is that Vulcan motto? Infinite diversity and infinite combinations. First of all, it's nice to hear the Idic.
Yes.
Yay. But I'm sure listeners out there who are fans of the wonderful Trek Ranks podcast can't help but think of the soundbite from the Trek Ranks podcast. So that did flash through my mind.
It flashed through mine too. And I also enjoy the Idic discussion. I think it's a nice way for people who maybe were coming to Enterprise as their first experience to Star Trek to get a little piece of the massive backstory without feeling like they were getting hit over the head by massive backstory. And it is very important, and it's something that we see. I mean, T'Pol has, the Idic symbol on a chain that we see her with throughout the series, so it's something that she's really thinking about, and nice of Dr. Phlox to kind of bring it back in his gentle way.
I have to say, Abby, I really enjoyed the scene of T'Pol giving the briefing to Trip and Archer as they're heading into the shuttle pod. That's a fantastic scene. First of all, she's saying very interesting things about her research, but Trip and Archer's reactions are pretty priceless. And then when Archer says, I thought Starfleet training was tough, I find that scene very endearing to me.
Well, I think it shows the growth in the relationship already, that, they've stopped from actually ribbing her about it as a way to get closer to her, but they can understand how she is and what she's trying to do enough that they can still make a joke between them, but it's with love now, and it's with respect, and it's with all of that behind it. It's not the, just a couple episodes ago taking the picture and trying to put his arm around her and she's kind of giving him the death stare. So even in just a few episodes, we can see that relationship has deepened. And I have more to say about that when we get further on in the episode, talking about the Archer T'Pol relationship. So put a pin in that and we will come back.
Okay, sounds good. So they land on the planet and make way into the atrium. What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I really want to ring that bell outside the sanctuary. I've always had a thing for bells on big old chains or cords like that. I think that they just have that tone that you can already tell, if this is their doorbell, that you can hear that from wherever in the sanctuary. And I really enjoyed that first scene where they first walk in and they're waiting after they ring the doorbell for quite a bit, enough for it to be awkward, and they see the doors obviously have damage, that they're kind of open, and finally they're like, all right, I guess we're just going in. And that's where I think this scene really takes off, because T'Pol says nothing, but Archer knows she's worried and Trip knows she's worried, and they work together so well already. And you can see that level of trust, because she didn't have to say anything to him. She could have just said everything's fine, because this was trusting him to say, I think something's up. But she had just given them that lecture of don't touch anything, don't see anything, don't breathe wrong, don't, anything. So for her to say, this is looking funky and that there's not enough monks here at the big atrium, that says a lot about how their relationship is really coming together and that they trust each other. So later on, when he does question her loyalty, it kind of hits deeper, because you can see right here that there's already that bond of trust. So it's an interesting dynamic to see just within this show, how it both deepens and thins depending on what's going on.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree. That scene at the beginning when they're feeling out the situation and Trip and Archer are making those signals to each other, the way that scene builds, the way it plays out is so well done. It's definitely one of my favorite scenes in the episode. And I agree with everything you just said about the way that they're working together. This episode is firing on all cylinders. I think there's a lot of excitement and tension and engagement and intrigue from the very beginning to the very end. It never lets up. That's why I think it's one of the best episodes of the season. And this scene kind of sets that off. So I agree with you. That was really cool how they handled that.
And I'd like to shout out Roxanne Dawson, the director, for this scene too, because the camera angles in this scene and showing how they're looking at things being slightly off and how they're seeing the reflection of the Andorian in the pot. And you're seeing it from all the different ways. And you see that big head statue with the, eyes and the nose the first time. And you know that that's meaning something just because of the way she shot it. You don't know what it means yet, but you know it means something. So that is many props to her. And I think the fact that she acted on Star Trek really helps her with some of these scenes, because that's a pretty tight room, so it's not like you had a ton of options of what you were going to do, but the way that she shot it adds to that tension and to that mystery. And then when everything does kind of come to a head and you have the explosion, you get that angle again from the ground up, from like kind of Archer's point of view, and that's just beautiful cinematography.
Yes, I agree. I think she did a fantastic job directing, and that foreshadowing and everything that you just mentioned, it was really well done. And I have to say, I also liked this scene for the Vulcan backstory. As I mentioned, I'm very interested in Vulcan culture and spirituality and all those things.
And we got a good sampling of that here with the Vulcan Elder.
And can I just say that Stone of Jakar would also be a great name for a band?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm going to throw those out there every now and then. Stone of Jakar. Love that.
So can we talk about the skeevy Andorian Tholos? He pops up pretty quickly with this. We come back from what would be a commercial break if you're watching with commercials, and the Andorians are there and they're giving all their bluster. And one of the first things that we see about him is that he is very interested in T'Pol in a very unkind way. And again, we've talked about this before, and it was 20 years ago, but he's so icky. He's so icky. Like, he's one of those people that, as a woman, I know sometimes you just get the hairs on the back of your neck stand up around people. And I know that is what was going on with all of them and with her. And he's consistent. I will say they wrote that character consistently. The actor played him well. But one of the moments that I really like, and it's not right here, but it's later on with Skeeve-tastic Tholos, that when he's going in on T'Pol again and saying, well, I hear that you Vulcan women want your mates to fight for you. Do you want me to kill somebody? And blah, 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 blah. And both Trip and Archer step in and diffuse it a little bit, take the attention off of her, that, something sure smells, and leave her alone. That is exactly what needed to happen, because T'Pol could not win in that situation. No matter what she said or did, it was going to make it worse. So it was really nice to see, and I think they would have done it for anybody, but it's nice to see them really step up and tell the creep to get lost.
Yeah, I agree. I find him icky also, and I don't care for the way it was written, that line that he first says at the beginning about it'll be great having you as a prisoner and all of that was, in my opinion, unnecessary. I don't think we needed this in the episode, and it's something I don't care for. So I agree with you. Skeeve-tastic is a nice little nickname for him.
And this part of the episode is just extremely unpleasant, just very gross and yucky.
So I agree.
And one thing I did want to bring up about my Skeeve-tastic friend here is that we do see him one more time still with Shran. And as we see Shran and the Andorians develop over this season and the entire series, it's nice to see that even though they were there and they were ready to be violent if need be, and they weren't all to his level. And that makes me very happy.
Yes, good point. I'd like to talk a little bit about Malcolm. I love that Malcolm's in command here, and I think that this is probably the first time that we see him in command. And what I really like about this scene, this is one of my favorite scenes. It was actually my backup for favorite part of the episode. I really appreciate how Malcolm just knows the right thing to say in a very, very tense moment when you have to think quickly. When
Yes.
Shran makes his demand, Malcolm could have started asking questions. He could have engaged Shran. There's a million things he could have said.
But he knows just what to do, and he just cuts to, let me speak to the captain.
And then when he says to Travis, I don't take orders from a comm console ensign or whatever his exact quote is. Fantastic line. And also Malcolm on the transporter pad too, ordering the other crewmen onto the transporter pad. Malcolm again is shining in this episode.
Yeah. And one of the things I noticed, I had notes on this as well, is that when Archer knows and he says, I didn't hire my tactical officer to sit on his butt. So he knows Malcolm's going to do something because that's his job and he's good at it. But later on, when Tucker calls on that really old transmitter, Malcolm, this is so the military man in him. He is no nonsense. He's using clipped language, short to the point sentences. He's getting the maximum amount of info in the minimum amount of time. And he is not letting emotions play into it. He's doing what he needs to do, getting the information, making a plan, and executing it. And yeah, that transporter moment where he's like, I've heard the same stories. Pull up those big boy pants and let's go. I mean, that's exactly what you want your tactical officer to do. So again, bravo to Malcolm. And then later on, when they're hiding in the tunnels and they're doing it all, he does exactly what he's supposed to do. This all ends the way it does because Malcolm did his job. But I would like to know, when he comes down to the planet, then who's in charge on the ship? Like, who's in command? Is it Phlox? Is it Hoshi? I mean, who's next? They do that a couple times. I do always wonder that. Like, if all the senior staff are gone, who's up there? Like, Delta Shift?
That's a very good question. I'm so curious about that also. I agree with you. I love the way Malcolm is choosing his wording and everything you just described. And when Archer does say, I didn't hire my tactical officer to sit on his butt, and the longer we stay here, the quicker he'll form a plan. I love that scene and I love what Archer's saying. My only thing is, talk quieter, Archer. You're all in this room and you're announcing the plan. Malcolm is going to be landing soon with a bunch of people. Quiet down. Don't tell the Andorians. But I do love that scene, and I do love that Archer does know what Malcolm is thinking, and they work together so well. Beautiful.
So another thing I wanted to touch base on really quickly is, since I do watch these episodes multiple times before we talk about them, every single time that I watch the scene where they are talking about, the Andorians show up, they do this, we have all these old relics and all of that, they flat out lie. And that's so different. And at first you feel this tone of, yeah, okay, well, these poor Vulcans and these poor monks and blah, blah, blah. And then when you realize that the entire time, this isn't bending the truth, this isn't lie by omission, they flat out lie. And that makes a whole different tone of not only that scene, but all the scenes of them together in that room, forming a plan, talking about what's going on, all this and that. It's a very different tone. And when I watch the two main monks, the older one and the younger one, and you watch them and their very minute facial expressions in that scene, it's really interesting because the less honest they're being, the more you see their face move. And I always wonder if that's a deliberate choice on the actors or not.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I noticed that also. I like those nuances because once you know the story and you see it again, you can really see that. And that leads me to a question that I was going to ask you, Abby. Do you think that the entire order on Pajem knew about the listening center, or do you think it was only those two monks? I can't tell.
I don't know either, but I also, well, when we talk about the ending, we'll come back to this too, because I have another question about, I think that at least more than two of them had to know just for safety's sake. But I can also see that, once you take the rights of the order or you become a certain level of monk or whatever, they let you in on the secret. But I also wonder, can they work the technology? I mean, there's obviously people in there doing it when we see it later, but are the monks, is that part of their job when they're higher up in the order, is doing something with the transmitter, or are they just there and happened to know about it.
My gut was they were just there. They were told about it. They knew where it was located, and it was their job just to make sure nobody ever entered there. I have a sense that they don't know how to work the technology, but there's no way to know. I mean, we don't know a lot about the Vulcans at this time. So that's a really intriguing question of how involved were they? Because the other thing I wondered is, does it violate their ethics?
Do they choose monks that agree and say they're cool with it?
Were they told the Andorians are going to attack us? Like, that's the part I'm a little unclear on, but I find it really intriguing to think about.
Yes, I agree. There's many, many layers to this. And more that I think as this becomes a continuing story, one of the arcs of this season and beyond, we get a little more about that, but we don't really ever find out all our answers to these mysterious monks.
Definitely. I wanted to talk a little bit about the nighttime scene.
Yes.
Where they're using the blankets. I had a few thoughts about that.
Is the first one that we must be really smelly because they sure bring it up a lot.
They certainly do bring it up a lot in this episode, for sure. I find the conversation between Archer and T'Pol very interesting because there are some topics here being explored that I find interesting. There's a conversation happening here between Archer and T'Pol, and I like that. There's also an interesting TOS callback here for the original series, and I'm just going to say that I have a feeling this isn't going to be the last time that I do a TOS callback. So, Abby, I think we might need a little jingle or soundbite for that. When Archer says to T'Pol, when push comes to shove and we have to get into this action here, are you by my side? Are you with me? And honestly, I think that was a logical question for him to ask. I know she was offended as much as a Vulcan can be offended, but it reminded me of several different instances where Kirk had to say to Spock, hey, killing's going to happen here. Are you with me? Can you do this? And Spock says, yes, I'm with you and I can do it. It completely reminded me of that. And I'm just going to throw out my other TOS callback right now, since we are talking about callbacks, which is when Icky Andorian is hitting on T'Pol. He does mention the Kali Fi from Amok Time.
Yep.
And that's another great callback. But back to this scene, I like the conversation. I do think, though, when T'Pol pulls the blanket off, it's a little out of character for me. That seems a little out of character for me. I don't think she would be that quote unquote emotional about it. But then again, we've talked before about how T'Pol is not so typical as a Vulcan. Her emotions are a little bit more on the surface. So I find that interesting. And I do think Archer had a right to ask her, because she was saying, we believe in nonviolence. And he's saying, well, now that you're part of the crew, now that our adventures are happening and things are rolling here, and we may come across some times where you're going to have to fight with me. Are you with me? So I think it was a reasonable question.
I agree. I think they were both completely justified. There was not a wrong step in this conversation. And I think it is a very important question because they have gotten deeper in that relationship. You can see the trust. They've picked up on each other's nonverbals. And, T'Pol is so subtle in everything that she does. And when she says she's only been living on the ship for 9 weeks, and they already have the level of working relationship that they do. And this is one of the first times where it almost becomes not personal in like a romantic way, but personal in we're two people in this really tough situation. We're not just coworkers here. And that's, I think, takes it to a deeper level. So she is offended. And I have always thought that blanket snatch at the end, because he did offer it to her to begin with, was totally a Vulcan FU.
Yeah, it sure felt that way.
All right. So I have to bring something up because this is kind of happening throughout all of these scenes and everything. It is so hard for me to watch Archer get beaten. Like, I'm squeamish. Like, I shut my eyes at stuff. I turn my head away. Like, But it's really hard to watch because it looks very realistic, and the bruises and the wounds, beside the fact that he keeps all his teeth, like, it's hard to watch. And I don't usually choose to watch media that has that much of that. And I know people are going to say space battles and Borg and all that, but that's one level away from reality. This is very real. It's very visceral. It's very intense. And by this third time I was watching this through, I did just turn away a couple of times. I'm like, I'll listen, but I don't want to watch this again. I don't want to watch this again so soon. And the rest of the episode, I want to watch all the time. So it's interesting for me to have that jarring, and it would be a different episode without it. The episode needs to show how serious and how threatening they are being, but it's hard.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's hard for me also. I find that challenging. And as much as we love the character Shran, because we do love Shran so much, and we're going to talk a lot about that on this podcast, this is a brutal opening. I mean,
Yes.
this is brutal, and it does show that our lovable Shran, who we love, has this part of him, this Andorian Imperial Guard part of him. And the episode does a really good job of showing that right off the bat, that this is the style of his command. This is how he operates. And I think it was done, even though it's difficult to watch, I believe it was done really, really well. Like you said, it felt real. It was shot very real. The makeup was on point. You know, Scott Bakula was fantastic. But I think it's an interesting window into how Shran operates. And while it's difficult to watch, that is interesting.
I agree. I was thinking, well, how did Archer get beat as bad as he did? I mean, and he took some gut punches to some internal organs and ribs and stuff there, but he must be super tough. Archer, after all that, moves pretty quick, shoots pretty well, gets comfy on a stone floor fairly decently to at least doze, and after like that really epic beatdown, he chokes Tholos with the rifle. I could not do that if I had just gotten beat up. I would be happy to be standing or sitting even after that. So Archer must have on his Superman clothes underneath there.
Yeah, Archer has the right stuff. I mean, he can roll with it, and this isn't the only time he gets beat up in Enterprise, and it's something that he can handle, and it's very difficult to watch. I also think the scene where Shran talks to Enterprise on the communicator and smashes the communicators, that's all done really, really well.
I agree completely. And I like this introduction to Shran because even within this episode, he has an arc and he's part of the series as a whole and has such a beautiful arc. You want to talk about characters that got redeemed? Here's one right here, because by the last episode of this series, you are rooting for him 100%. And the first half of this episode, you would shove him on an airlock. Can't get much better than that for an arc.
Oh, I agree. What a phenomenal actor and what a beloved character, at least for me. I find Shran to be such a highlight of Enterprise. Every scene he's in, he brings and boosts so much energy in such a great way. And I'm sure we'll talk about that more as the series goes on. But yes, that is definitely a great arc there. I agree.
So let's talk about this big ending and about the big stone face and dropping it in. And there's Archer being Superman again, because he volunteered pretty much to get himself beat again to drop that little statue. But bravo to Trip for being so curious to look down all the tunnels when he's down there and see everything he can and bring back pretty much a map in his head. And they do a great job of getting a plan together, figuring something out, but it's a pretty good plan and it goes off pretty much how they wanted it to. I mean, they do get into the catacombs and, have a firefight, but the rescue plan is pretty good. Thank goodness for that transporter.
Oh, I agree. And that's one of the reasons why I think this episode is firing on all cylinders is from beginning to end, this nonstop action. And the rescue plan is a huge part of that. And there's a lot of dramatic tension happening here. And And that's one of the things I love about the episode so much was the way it was constructed with all these dramatic scenes, and tension was just so well done.
All right, so here's a question, and here's where I want to talk about these workers on the transmitter and the monks and all that. So the big secret door, thank goodness that the Vulcan, who's never shot a rifle trying to shoot things, knocks it down himself. But why does that great big secret door not have a lock or a code or any key? I mean, Archer opens it with an elevator button. And so then I wonder, okay, so if the monks ever have to go down there for any reason, it was real obvious that there were spider webs and dust and all this. Do they replace those? Like, is there some little peon monk whose job it is to replace cobwebs and dust and make it look like nobody's been there for a bazillion years? So, okay, maybe they don't go in and out that door and they just transport there. Then why is there a door at all that could possibly be discovered? If you're going to have an underground transmitter that you have to beam in and out of so as not to disturb stuff, just transport in. And I don't know. And nobody working those sensors seemed to stop and notice that these people all are just found them. And I was like, maybe they're too far away. Maybe there's a set, but one would think they'd have a proximity alarm, a perimeter alert, something in there. So while I loved the reveal, and even though I sort of saw it coming the first time I watched it, I love this reveal. Every time I'm just like, dude, why did they not lock the door? They need a deadbolt or something. At least make it hard to open. The tapestry was pretty easy.
You know what? That is a really good point. I love the reveal too so much, but I hadn't thought about that. That is a really good point, Abby. Archer just pressed a button and boom. But to answer your question, I had a thought about this too, because when they went deep down there, those candles were all lit and still burning, which, by the way, may not be the safest thing to do in your basement.
Yes.
Unattended. But that being said, that told me that monks do go down there regularly. I think people are attending to that area. They must be at some point. But that's a really good point, Abby.
It just makes me laugh. And, I hope that all of our listeners know that we think about these things and we love Enterprise anyway, because it's nothing but love from here, because it's okay to have these questions. Obviously, Star Trek is supposed to make you think.
Exactly. It is definitely done with love. Well, now we've arrived at Porthos's pick, which is our favorite part of the episode. Abby, what's your favorite part of the Andorian incident?
Well, I have to say that I picked a tiny little moment, because I love that Trip oftentimes says out loud what most of the audience is thinking. And when they're in the room and they first show him the little secret passage and they move the little stone and the wall goes in, and it's just like every bad murder mystery or playing Clue or something like that. And he says, "For people without emotion, you sure have a flair for the dramatic." It was perfect, because we're all thinking that when we see it, we're like, what? Are you serious? And the Vulcans are pretty dramatic. They dress dramatically. Their ceremonies are dramatic. I mean, even the fact that they do have emotions, but they suppress them, that's pretty dramatic. I mean, they're pretty black and white. So I just really enjoyed that, and I enjoy when Trip comes out and he's always been the everyman, but right here, this was a perfect example of doing it well.
That's a great pick, Abby. Trip has some wonderful lines in this episode, and he does. You're right. He does say what people are thinking. For example, when he says, "Now these guys are agitated." That's another great line.
Yes.
A flair for the dramatic there's some really great writing in here. I agree. And Trip's just such a fun character. I love seeing him on these away missions where he gets to say lines like that and participate in the episode this way. So I think that's a great pick.
What about you? What's your favorite this time?
Well, it's funny because my backup pick was also a Trip line, so I'll just throw it out there. I love when Trip is down in the catacombs and says, "Fellas."
It gets me every time.
I just love that. It's perfect.
And respectful, but still Trip.
Very, very Trip, fellas. My favorite part is at the end with the big reveal going on here.
First of all, I think T'Pol's reactions here are really fascinating. She's obviously really shocked and surprised with what she's seeing. And, we've talked before about the facial expressions that she does, those minute expressions that show so much. She's looking so surprised and absorbing it and taking all that in. And then Archer saying to her, does that thing take images and give it to Shran? That's a really great sequence. And
I absolutely love Shran's reactions during this scene. As I mentioned, even though Shran is introduced to us in this very strong, brutal fashion, he does grow to become one of our favorite characters. And the seeds are planted right here. You can really feel what Shran is thinking. When he gets the scanner from T'Pol and he turns to exit the door, he stops. He thinks, he turns back and says, "We are in your debt." Now, he could have just grabbed that scanner and ran, but no, this meant something to him. This has meaning for him. He turns and talks to Archer about it. And this is where the seeds are planted for the fascinating and complicated and wonderful, amazing friendship and relationship between Archer and Shran, which is at such a big heart of this series. And this, in essence, also plants the seeds for the future of the Federation with Andorians and humans, going from this episode right at the very beginning of the series through to the end, when think about what's happening in an episode like Terra Prime. So I just love that moment when Shran turns to Archer and says that, because I think it's impactful.
Well, I could not agree with you more. And I remember the first time that I watched this episode, and I was thinking there was one more scene, like there was going to be one more something, because I'm like, wait a minute, that's it? He's just going to walk out and be in his debt and the shuttle's going to fly. No, I need more of this story. And that's how good this one was, that an ending that is actually, now that I rewatch and I know what's coming, is perfect for this first chapter, felt so disappointing on an original watch because I wanted more of the story. So when Shadows of Pajem comes up a few episodes down the road and we see this next step, you really start to appreciate that ending in a different way.
Definitely.
Accessing library computer data.
And now it's time for the sharing of trivia. Abby, what can you tell us about this episode?
Well, I always like these little behind the scenes of how reality creeps in. So I liked that I found out that the satellite image of Pajem that they see on the display table in the Situation Room is actually a retouched photograph of a boulder from Yosemite National Park. So I think that's always neat to see where they get those inspirations.
Oh, wow. That's so cool. I didn't know that.
What'd you find out about this one, Melanie?
So for this one, when T'Pol says that she's been on the ship for 9 weeks and 4 days, roughly, I know some of the episodes list the calendar date and some do not. This one does not. But based on what T'Pol was saying, I learned that this episode is taking place on June 19th, 2151. And because we are recording this episode the week of June 19th, I realized that the Andorian Incident is taking place exactly 130 years from this week.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I just found that interesting to think about what's going to be happening in 130 years. Where is our humans in Starfleet?
Perfect.
Transfer of data is complete.
All right, we've reached our Vulcan's verdict. On a scale of 1 to 10 grapplers, how do you rate this episode, Abby?
Well, this is one of my favorites of season 1, but I still have to say that Archer stuff just takes it down one little notch for me, because I like to be able to see every second of my episodes. So I also agree with what you said before, that it shows the seeds of how Andorians become founders of the Federation. I had to land with this one on an 8.
Sounds good.
What about you?
If we put our icky Andorian aside, because this episode introduces Shran, and because for me, not only is it one of the best episodes of season 1, but I personally think it's one of the best episodes in the whole series, I am giving it a 9 out of 10 grapplers.
Our chronometer's running backwards, sir.
Incoming transmission.
You read my letter?
Well, now it is time for Daniels to send us back in the timeline so we can share some of your picks. Abby, what do you have for us tonight?
All right, so let's go back to episode 3, Strange New World. And we got a comment on Twitter from Care Bear. That's at CareBearLib, KerrBearlib. And she said, I agree 100% with Abby that it's cool to see all the meal scenes. My husband once pointed out that we rarely get to see Trek crews sit down, enjoy a meal, and just chill. Enterprise is the exception to that, and I think it's awesome. So I'm pretty sure we're talking about meal scenes more, Carrie, so be prepared for more food chat. And I have one more from our last episode, episode 5, Terra Nova. And this is from Michael Loves the NHS and at Michael Angie, A-N-G-I-E. And he said, enjoyable discussion about an episode I've always liked despite its poor reputation. Great connection to a certain TOS episode, and nice to hear Malcolm get some appreciation. He's really pretty good here. Look at that, 2 episodes in a row, Malcolm getting some love. So thank you both for sending those in to us. We absolutely adore hearing your feedback. It makes us feel all glowy for the whole day. So keep them coming, and we'd love to read some more.
All right. Thank you, Carrie and Michael. And if you've enjoyed this conversation and would like to continue the discussion with us, or share your Porthos picks or Grappler ratings or thoughts, you can reach us at First Flight Pod on Twitter and Instagram. Where can they reach you, Abby?
Best place to get me is on Twitter, and that's Abby M. Sommer. That's SOMMER.
We want to thank you so much for spending this time with us, and we hope you'll join us next time when we will discuss the 7th episode of Season 1, Breaking the Ice. And as always, we leave you with this quote from Captain Jonathan Archer.
The most profound discoveries are not necessarily beyond that next star. They're within us, woven into the threads that bind us, all of us, to each other.